Hello and welcome back. It is finally time to answer the question we've all been waiting for. Can this engine still be saved? Let's find out. We'll jump right into it by firstly removing the auxiliary water tank. Two 12mm bolts. We can now also take off the auxiliary belt. At this point, I would love to take off these intercoolers. We need to firstly take off these V-bands of the charge pipes. And now the charge pipes are completely loose. At this point, we have to lower the thermostat, or whatever this piece is, to be able to access the last bolt of the left intercooler. Okay, that seems enough. I think it would just make a whole lot more sense if we just removed all of this vacuum thing. That's the first. Then the plug. I think this slides right off. There it is. With a little bit of persuasion. You've got to be extra careful with all of these plugs because of the heat this engine works with. They all get very brittle over time. And undo the intercooler mounting bolts. To create some more space, let's now remove the turbo feed hoses. Up next, let's try to get rid of this AC compressor. To do so, we need to remove the 4 bolts on the vibration damper, rotate it until this gap reaches this part, and then it will all just slide towards the AC compressor, giving us enough slack in the belt to be able to completely take it off. And now, after we spun it, you can see that both the vibration damper and the belt are loose, so we can just simply slide it off. Now, to remove the vibration damper, we need to remove this circlip. Okay. And now the vibration damper should just slide off. The AC compressor is being held down by 4 T25 Torx bolts. But before we slide it off, we need to also disconnect the plug. And now we can proceed to undo the fourth and final bolt. And now, before we proceed to anything else, I would love to get rid of this engine wiring harness. So let's try and see how hard it is to remove it. The starter motor plug, the coil packs plug. I believe this is for the exhaust camshaft sensor. And then this one should be the intake camshaft sensor. Tuck them to the side and let's see what's holding it in. Looks like there's a 10mm bolt. There are two more 10mm bolts over here. There's a fallen bolt in there actually. Let me try to grab it. Okay, we need to unplug the plug for the high pressure fuel pump. And this one was already unplugged. So I believe this is from the MAF sensor. Routing all of these wires and plugs is going to be a great experience. I can already tell. Okay, we need to undo the plug for the O2 sensor and the plug for the secondary O2 sensor. There's two tabs which we need to break. Down here there's two more plugs, one for the intake map sensor and one for the fuel rail. There's one. There's two. We've come back down again because there are two plugs for the NOx sensor that we need to undo. There's one. There's two. Now this whole thing just unclips and should lift up. This whole wiring loom is just crumbling under its own weight, really. I believe it would be a little bit hard for the starter wire to come out this time with the intake manifold still on. So I think I'll just leave it on for now and take it off at a later time when we also detach the intake manifold. With that one set aside, we still have another 10mm bolt. There is a plug over here for one of the turbine actuators, I believe. And now let's unclip all of the front plugs, making sure to forget where each one goes, of course. Let's put these out of the way. What in the world? Who's gonna do that one? Well, I guess I am. As I said, routing all of these is gonna be wonderful. Since this is a V8, it is pretty much a copy and paste onto the other side now. Exhaust camshaft sensor, intake camshaft sensor, intake map sensor, the 10mm bolts, the two NOx sensors. There's one, and there's two. Now we can just pull them upwards. Okay. First O2 sensor plug, secondary O2 sensor plug, high pressure fuel pump, the I have no idea plug. Just kidding, this is most likely an intake fuel sensor. Okay, most of these are now unplugged. feather. Okay, and now there's some stuff in the front that we need to disconnect. All right, there is another fuel rail sensor sitting over here. And it looks like we've got most of it out. So let's remove the 10mm bolt. And let's see where it takes us. Actually, it looks like it's pretty ready to come out. Okay, looks like it just lifts upwards. And now we've got a giant mess. So let's try to pull it on this side. This is gonna be quite the challenge, I believe. If you don't remove this hose, which I think would be our best bet right now. Okay, why not fall? So with this to the side, we should now, realistically speaking, be able to just lift up. Does this engine now not look a million times easier to work on without all of the stupid wires? Let's finally see what surprises are awaiting us in this beast's belly and drop the oil. Ooh, close one. The O2 sensors, which is pretty easy because one is already loose. To remove the protective shields off of the cats, we first need to remove this small bracket over here. Okay, here is the set bracket. Since it is in our way and it is actually holding the heat shield, let's remove this bracket. There's the same two bolts on the other side. And now it should, and I mean should, be free. But of course we need to disconnect the PCV hoses first. Okay, that's one. And here's the second. Okay, now we can deal with the heat shields themselves. And to do so, we need to release this safety clip of the secondary O2 sensors, which you just push out. And it's the same exact thing on the other side, just that the space here is even tighter, if you believe this is possible. And of course I forgot about the bracket from the other side. Here is the bracket, and there are 3 more heat shield screws that we need to deal with. Oh no, I guess we've just ruined the engine. Voila. You can even see by the exhaust fumes how the right O2 sensor was already loose. As you can see, exhaust gases were already escaping through here. Well, I guess it's not ruined after all, huh? We could even probably start it. To remove the left catalytic converter, we need to get rid of the starter motor, and to do so, we also need to remove the motor mount. Well, there goes the nut for the positive terminal. Now we can slide it out, take out the starter. We can now proceed with the PCV hoses. This was already loose as well. We'll leave the V-band on the turbine, and now we only need to disconnect the bracket for the catalytic converter to come out. There is in fact another bracket on the back. And since we are already here, let's also remove this last heat shield. And now let's copy and paste it onto the other side. And out comes the second one. Surely, right? After a second thought, let's remove this engine lifting hook because it is in the way of our oxygen sensor, and we would either have to remove the oxygen sensor or the hook, which seems easier to me. Moving on to the front, where we'll remove the water pump. To completely remove this bolt of the water pump, we need to get rid of this hose. The alternator positive wire that goes to the starter motor. Now the alternator and all of its brackets. To make the removal of the alternator a bit easier, I'm going to firstly take off this vacuum hose that runs across the whole engine. And we'll just leave it hanging for now. And let's see how we can sneak it out of here. Okay, so looks like we also need to remove two nuts from the high pressure fuel pump crossover line. Okay, and there is the alternator. The second auxiliary water pump. The coil packs wiring loom. And now the injector plugs. Disconnect the fuel intake hose. This high pressure fuel pump crossover line is in the way of removing our ignition coil wiring loom, So we're gonna have to deal with it right now. I placed a rag under because normally these lines are under pressure. Redo it all onto the other side. And now carefully remove it all together. Unclip the vacuum hose from the vacuum pump and we'll tuck it to the side for now. And also the ignition coils themselves. After we have freed up some more space, it is pretty easy to remove these PCV hoses, as due to heat and age they are pretty brittle, and removing them with all of the wires in place would mean instant breakage. Whew, finally. Up next, we are going to finally deal with the turbines, and to do so I'm going to remove the two vacuum hoses from the turbo actuators, this one and this one, and as you can see this one is already loose and is pretty ready to come out. So I'm really not sure how this car was running beforehand, but it's surely not that well. All of these vacuum hoses that I have been touching throughout this dismantle have looked rather poorly. So as part of our maintenance, we're also going to change these out for some new rubber ones, as these get pretty brittle with time and they start leaking vacuum, which in turn creates all sorts of problems. Let's now move on to the turbos. We'll begin by removing the oil feed lines. Now there are two brackets, one for each oil line. The V-bands. Okay, one is off. Okay. And now it appears that the only thing still holding them on are the oil drain lines. The turbines are still interconnected with these coolant hoses, and I'm going to remove one off of each turbine so that each one of them leaves with their separate coolant hose. There goes the copper washer. And we also have to remove their respective brackets. Before moving on to the oil drain lines, I would like to firstly remove this coolant head exchange hose that is a bit in the way, and taking it out would make it a whole lot easier. Now we'll proceed with the turbo oil drain lines, which as you can see are so easy to get to. And here's the second. Let's remove these heat shields. I am not sure how well you can see this, but it is clear that the V-band from the left catalytic converter was loose, judging by how smooth this bolt is. The exhaust manifold. Remove this metal piece. And now the manifold. The gasket. Rinse and repeat. First take out the metal piece. And now the manifold. The gasket. Now the millionth heat shield. Does this ring a bell? Let's remove these two oil feed pipes for the turbos. The vacuum canister. But in order to remove the vacuum canister, we also need to take care of the boost solenoids and their respective brackets. One bolt is already loose since we took out the intercooler. And there's two more. And now they should all come out together as a whole unit. The fuel lines. Actually, now that I think about it, I don't even have to undo the nuts off of the fuel rail, because I'm just going to lift it up after removing them from the injectors and from the high pressure fuel pump, and there's no need to remove them from the fuel rail itself. It's just going to lift up as a whole unit. Copy paste onto the other side, except that this time we know not to disconnect the lines from the fuel rail itself. The high pressure fuel pump. The intake manifold. And the T30 at the front. Whew. I know this is going to be very hard to catch on video, but just look at the amount of oil there is in this intake manifold. It's dripping out, and I'm not even tilting it that much. But something even more interesting, look what I found inside. A piece of very, very hard metal shaving. so perhaps a sign of things to come. Either way, let's get back to work and remove this cable that runs all the way to the starter. Again, some T30s. Let's now see if we can remove these index 12 injectors without the fancy tools. Firstly, this metal bracket. Whew. Well, that's one out. That's absolutely, and I mean absolutely, covered in oil and debris. And now the ones from the first bank. Now, in the end, I did manage to get it done, but would I recommend it to you? Most definitely not. You would much rather buy the proper tool and do it easier than I did, because I was pretty lucky that only the injector from cylinder number 2 was as tightly in there as it was, because otherwise this would have taken a lot more than it has. Now let's get to the fun part and remove both valve covers. Do you remember when I said that whoever used this many zip ties must be a zip tie master? Well, I guess he must also be an RTV master, because look at how tightly glued together this valve cover and the head are. I even had to hammer in an old knife to be able to separate them. My timing tools have not yet arrived, but even so, before we take off the harmonic balancer, we need to take note of this marking right here, because this is the one that is used to time the crankshaft. When this marking reaches this point, it means that the crankshaft is in the correct timing position. This, however, does not mean that the camshafts are also in the correct timing position, but we will get onto that later. For now, let's spin the engine until the crankshaft is in the correct position. And now slowly, right on the money. To set the camshafts in the timing position, the exhaust camshaft from the first bank needs to have the lobes from the first cylinder pointing upwards, while the intake camshaft must have its lobes pointing downwards. In our case, this has happened on the first try, but otherwise we would have had to just spin the crankshaft one more full rotation.
Alright, now firstly let's remove the vanos solenoids. The two front timing covers. Yeah, you've guessed it. Most likely the old gasket with a ton of RTV on it. Now to undo the timing chains, firstly we'll start on the first bank, which is the left one. And to undo all of this timing madness, what we need to do is firstly remove this tensioner over here, and to do so I'm going to rotate the intake camshaft so that the tensioner gets pulled inwards to lock the tensioner and to be able to safely remove it. Okay, so this one's too thin. Well, I guess I found the right fit. A small L fits perfectly in there.
Here's our little ticking bomb.
Now let's loosen the vanos bolts. Okay. The upper tensioner. Okay, out it comes. And there's the exhaust. That's one side done. Now let's repeat it onto the other. While we remove the cylinder heads from the block, the timing chain guides are going to stay with the block. So to allow for this to happen, we need to release this timing chain pin that is holding the guide rails to the cylinder head. Well, that just happened. Oh, finally. What do you think? Is the second one gonna be any easier? Let's find out. And then this just comes undone as easily as that. Are you kidding me, man? Someone definitely overturned the left one. Definitely. Well, now, to me, this looks like the perfect time to start undoing the head bolts and to remove the cylinder head altogether. So, let's begin. Wowie zowie. Well, I guess there's no need for any more explanations. And well, this is the kind of damage that I was expecting ever since I've started the teardown, because I kept finding all the signs that were telling me that a piston might have broken down. I even found some metal pieces in the intake manifold. I've heard some pieces rumbling in the oil sump. So, honestly speaking, I was kind of expecting this to be how this engine failed. But nonetheless, it's still very interesting to see. Do you want to have a look? Hello. Well, now that we know that this engine is kaput and completely trash, let's take out the other cylinder head as well and see what the damage looks like on this side. Well, honestly, after seeing the other side's piston and actually looking through the bore and seeing the crankshaft, I'm not gonna lie, I was expecting this piston to look even worse. Let's see if it's moving. On its own. Exactly as I thought. There is no connecting rod. This piston is only sitting in here under its own weight. Okay, so at this point I'm only going to turn it upside down and have a look inside of it for demonstration purposes, because as far as I'm concerned, this is nothing more than content and a break in my wallet. As the brand states, BMW, break my wallet. Because, for starters, the piston on the other side broke that badly that it scored the cylinder block far beyond what is repairable. And before you think about honing it or using sleeves, let me tell you this. The engine block is damaged so bad that it is far beyond repair and far beyond what I would trust to use on any of my cars, let alone even sell it afterwards. But if you don't think that is enough, let me show you another thing. Well, I guess it doesn't even matter now that it fell, but what does matter is this right here. Because as you can see, that is something that you definitely don't want to ever look at when rebuilding an engine. This engine is completely, completely kaput. Just look at the size of this hole and of the hole and all of the cracks going upwards. Look at this one. It's even worse. I always thought that the oil pan was leaking right around here because I always saw drips of oil coming out, but I never thought that this was the case because it was sitting right under the motor mount and you could barely even spot it from underneath. That's why I took it off, so I could show it better to you. But while it was in the car and right after I took it out, it was just so hard to spot it. I really thought this was an active oil leak of some sort. Now let's flip this around and have a little bit of fun. Let's finally crack it open. And I literally mean crack it. There's so much RTV used on here that you have to then punch it. And it's still not budging. Aha, finally. I've had to swap hammers a couple of times and obliterate my fingers in the process. But finally, you can take it out. But you know, that's what I like to believe. Just look at all of this mess. Metal shavings, all the range. Ooh la la. Let me show you what's in the oil pickup tube. Well, basically this. RTV and metal shavings. This is why you want to use RTV on engines, to get it in the oil pickup tube, obviously. Look at all of this. Oh my god. The more you search for, the more you find. Let's remove the oil filter, and don't even begin to ask me how I managed to undo it, because I don't have the fancy tool. At this point, I'm actually pretty curious what's inside of the oil filter after seeing so much debris in the engine. Nothing out of the ordinary, just don't even wonder. It's as full of metal shavings as you might expect. You can see all the glitter in there. Whew, finally, man. This took some effort. Actually, I believe I should remove the oil pickup tube first. Carnage. That's the only way to put it. Absolute carnage. There's pieces of rod everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Look at how bent this one is. Holy smokes.
Here we can now finally take a closer look at the damage. For those of you who are unfamiliar, these were once the connecting rod bearings, which are the thin piece of metal compound that sit on a journal inside of either the engine block or the connecting rod's cap and allow the crankshaft to rotate onto them. This is possible by creating a constant layer of pressurized oil between the bearing and the crankshaft, which allows it to spin effortlessly and for the two parts to never come in contact one with another. When the pressure of the oil separating them becomes too little, however, things start getting really hot really quickly, and it just keeps on getting worse by the minute. The causes of this happening range from wear of the oil pump to long oil service intervals and just poor general maintenance of the engine. Judging by how destroyed everything inside is, I will guess that this has indeed happened at high engine RPMs and that the connecting rods got so hot that they eventually exploded and creating all of this mess. In the end, the curiosity got the best out of me, so I ended up stripping it down even more. Well, it seems like we have just found the culprit of all of our problems. This main bearing is spun. It is not sitting correctly in its own place. It has indeed rotated inside of the engine block and has in turn blocked the oil passage that was directing oil to these conrod bearings. This is how it actually occurred because these conrod bearings get oiled through a passage from the main bearing. So if this spins and it blocks the oil passage, you can imagine how quickly this can go bad. And here is the perfect example.
And with this, sadly, we have reached the end of our own teardown, because the engine teardown, well, as you can see, it took place quite some time ago, and quite more destructive than we could have ever done so. But not to worry, because even though the next episode might come at a later time than the usual uploads, it is only because the N63 engines are so hard to come by that I've been looking for them for quite some time now, because I was expecting something similar to this prior to seeing with my own eyes. As soon as I started tearing it down, there were already signs that the piston might have been broken, so I was preparing for the worst. So if you have an N63 up for sale, shoot me a DM and maybe we can make something work out. But until next time, stay tuned and wish me luck.